This is Matthew Cratter from Bitcoin University, and today I wanted to talk about the enormous tumor that has just attacked Bitcoin. That tumor, of course, is Nassim Taleb, who's a well-known former options trader and essayist who's actually written some of my favorite books of all time, Fooled by Randomness, The Black Swan, Anti-Fragile. These are still well worth checking out, and in my mind, I find it difficult to reconcile how good these books are with what the author has become over the past few years. This was a guy who started off writing the preface, the foreword to Saifedean Ammous's The Bitcoin Standard, in which in this foreword he critiques central banks, etc. But something happened over the past few years where he turned on Bitcoin and turned on Bitcoiners in September of 2022, calling Bitcoin a tumor. This is, of course, where this video gets its title from. And then he went on to call almost all Bitcoiners total idiots. And then he sold all of his Bitcoin. He said, I've been getting rid of my BTC. Why? A currency is never supposed to be more volatile than what you buy and sell with it. You can't price goods in BTC. This is something we've covered. This is a sort of a newbie objection to Bitcoin that we've covered in many, many videos. Obviously, the market cap of Bitcoin is quite small relative to the market cap of traditional financial assets. So what you have, something like the ocean trying to make its way into the swimming pool, you get a lot of volatility coming out of that. In the same way that you got a lot of volatility in the early days in Tesla and Amazon and Microsoft. And then as they became, have had larger market caps and became more established as assets, the volatility went down. This is what we expect to happen to Bitcoin. And again, this is really newbie FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which he's pushing, but he did end up selling his Bitcoin. But we learned one of the real reasons is he said in that respect, it's a failure, at least for now. And then we learned his real objection, which is, quote unquote, it was taken over by COVID, denying sociopaths with the sophistication of amoebas. Here's a great tweet from Saif Ammous responding to Taleb, basically making this connection, which they both have, to Lebanon. Many Lebanese in hyperinflation are ignoring Bitcoin because they think this world expert on risk, Taleb, has a point about Bitcoin more profound than him just being an inflamed mess. Their currency is collapsing and their risk expert is telling them the only working life raft has no use. This is one of the more tragic things that is the result of Taleb's hatred of Bitcoin, which we're going to talk about in a moment. I would just ask you right now, if you're finding this video useful, to hit that subscribe button. That would really help out the channel. Hit the like button, leave a comment or question. So Lebanon has obviously been experiencing this monetary crisis for the past few years. And at the same time, we have Taleb, one of the children of Lebanon, this is where he was born, talking about how Bitcoin is a terrible hedge. Now, if you take a look at what's happened in Lebanon, we covered this previously extensively in other videos. It reached a point where customers had to actually rob banks to try to get their own money out, not someone else's money, but their own money out. And then all the Lebanese banks closed indefinitely, and then the currency was devalued officially by 90%. I think unofficially it went down more than even that. And so if we take a look at how people's savings would have performed if they had held them in Bitcoin rather than holding them in the local currency, here we can see Bitcoin denominated in Lebanese pounds over the past year up almost 1,300%. You read that correctly. That's the last 12 months. By contrast, Bitcoin in US dollar terms is only up 41%. But we can see here that currencies with higher inflation and more money printing Bitcoin ends up being a quite good hedge for them. So he was just plain wrong about this. And unfortunately, he misled a lot of people. And now, as of yesterday, we got this interview with Taleb on CNBC, which was really strange because you had all the hosts there defending Bitcoin against him, and his critiques of Bitcoin were rather unsophisticated. And it's funny to see people like Joe Kernan just trying to gently correct him, as you have to do with guests like this. I'll link to this in the description notes below. I'm not going to play the video right now, but it starts off with Taleb, it appears, has just called Bitcoin a bubble, and one of the hosts says, how can you call it a bubble? Do bubbles normally last 14 years? This is the point I've been making for years about Bitcoin not being anything like the tulip bubble, because tulips never came back and hit new all-time highs, as Bitcoin has done many times before, and as Bitcoin will probably do in the coming 12 months, thanks to the BlackRock ETF almost certainly being approved. There are some other red flags in this CNBC interview. Taleb used the words crypto and Bitcoin quite interchangeably. This obviously shows a real lack of understanding of the difference between crypto, which is mostly unregistered securities issued and controlled by a small group of insiders, versus Bitcoin, which is a true digital commodity, an asset without an issuer. And so just when people mix up this language, you can tell they're not very clear thinkers, which is unfortunate because Taleb has talked a lot about the importance of thinking clearly and the importance of choosing your words and your language very carefully. Later in this interview, Taleb goes on to call Bitcoin and Bitcoiners a cult, and I think this is an unfair characterization of it. And it's also, I think, also bad investing advice, because historically investing in assets that a lot of people are really passionate about over a period of 5-10 years has historically been a great decision. You have companies like Coca-Cola in the 20th century, then in the 21st century, companies like Apple and Tesla, which look a little bit like cults, and they have a very devoted fan base that does a lot of evangelism for their products as well. So even calling Bitcoin a cult, if you believe this, obviously it's not strictly speaking a cult, because there's no cult leader, there's no one in charge of it, it's completely decentralized. But even if it were a cult, that is hardly a critique. That's usually turns out to be a fairly good investment. Taleb goes on to say that Bitcoin is a poor inflation hedge. I cover this extensively in this video. Has Bitcoin failed as an inflation hedge? There's a lot of nuance to this question. If you want a shortcut, though, you can just, again, take a look at that Bitcoin priced in Lebanese pounds, and this shows you how Bitcoin is actually a very good inflation hedge. It's not a day-to-day inflation hedge, but it does help to protect against central bank money printing and the devaluation of the local currency. Here we can see Bitcoin up almost 5,000% over the past 5 years. So why exactly is Taleb so angry at Bitcoin? I think there's some of the COVID remnants, and he didn't like the stance that a lot of Bitcoiners took surrounding COVID. But we also learned from this recent CNBC interview that Taleb hates Bitcoin because he and other Wall Street traders cannot control it. And here's the key quote from that interview you can go back and listen to. This is Taleb speaking, quote, "At least with the Federal Reserve, we have transparency," which of course we don't. He claims we do. He says we know what's going on inside the Fed. We can influence it. There's a system. And I think that's the key phrase right there. We can influence it. He lets the mask slip for a moment there. That's the key phrase from this cantillionaire, someone who has stood very close to the money printer on Wall Street and has made his money by being part of the bloated finance industry, which is a direct result of having a fiat system. Bitcoin's monetary policy is not beholden to Wall Street cantillionaires like Taleb, which is why he hates it so much. And he actually takes off the mask and says that he prefers the Fed and other central bankers over Bitcoin. This is just a tragic thing to say. He knows what central bankers and money printing has done in Lebanon, and now he's taking the side of the Fed, which is what happens when you turn on Bitcoin and you become irrational and emotional about it. You really paint yourself into a corner, and that's why someone who's as intellectually intelligent as Taleb seems to have gone off the deep end, because he's afraid of reversing himself. This is a common cognitive bias that we humans are subject to. Taleb also says that Bitcoin is a useless technology that's fit only for gambling and speculation. And this is a thought that I want to leave you with, because this is a common critique from newbies, and Taleb is certainly not a noob. This leads me to believe that possibly he's been compromised. There's some pressure on him. That's another possibility, because it's hard for me to understand how someone goes from completely understanding Bitcoin and being fairly sophisticated about it and being a fairly early investor to completely hating it. Bitcoin is a useful technology for those who don't want their savings to be confiscated, censored, or devalued by their government or by their central bank. And as we talked about, the Lebanese liquidity crisis, the financial crisis, was a perfect example of a tragic series of events that Taleb's own Lebanese friends and family could have protected themselves from by using Bitcoin. So for Taleb to claim that Bitcoin has no use case is to betray one's own first world fiat privilege. And this is really all that we see in these videos. We see a fairly spoiled, obese man-child raging against Bitcoin and not even having fairly sophisticated arguments against it. It's a rather pathetic display, if you ask me. If your country has an honest banking system, if that actually exists anywhere, and property rights, you probably don't need Bitcoin today or tomorrow. But as more and more fiat currencies fail, like the Lebanese pound, the practical use case for Bitcoin will continue to grow, and we can expect this to continue to enrage people like Nassim Taleb, who have basically turned against it and now are forced into a very indefensible intellectual position. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.